Hey guys, today we are going to get through what is chapter 11 in my book. I think we're all on the same chapters now. I think they were just off at the beginning on public opinion. I'm going to also post your third quiz and the due date for that. And then next week we have your second exam, and it will be posted on Monday. On Monday, I will also post your essay prompt. So you will have plenty of time to look at that. That is not due until November 29th. So you have plenty of time for that. I don't give any extensions for that because I've given you a lot of time on it. But I will post your instructions. I will post your prompt and what you need to do for that. It should be very self-explanatory, but of course, ask me if you have any questions. So quiz 3 this week. Next week, exam 2. Then we have 1, 2, 3. We only have 4 more lectures before the end of the semester. It's going by fast. We'll have after next week's exam, we'll only have 1 more quiz and 1 more exam, and your final essay will be due. The last day of class is November 29th, and your final exam is December 6th, and then we're done for the semester. So hang in there. We're almost there, even though it doesn't feel like it. We really are. All right, public opinion. So what's at stake when we move to a direct democracy? So in June 2016, the United Kingdom put out a very important referendum, which is a popular vote on, this had been held on whether or not the United Kingdom, which is England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Gibraltar, Great Britain, would retain its membership in the European Union, the EU, which is an economic and political union of 28 European countries that mostly dates back to World War II. The United Kingdom's always been a little different from the rest of Europe. They've never adopted the euro. They have different immigration concerns, and the European Union allows for free travel between their member states. But in June of 2016, they had this referendum on what we call now the Brexit, the British exit. And it said that before this, the polls kind of showed that public opinion favored remaining in the EU, which was shared by David Cameron, who's the prime minister at the time. So he wanted to hold the vote just to kind of appeal to his opponents and be like, listen, they're going to vote in my favor, so let's just put it out there anyway. Well, then the Brexit won. It was only like 51.9% of the vote. Cameron actually ended up resigning, and a lot of Brits were expressing misgivings about the way they'd voted since they'd previously been a little loose with the facts. At that point, Theresa May became prime minister. Since then, she has resigned, and now Boris Johnson is the prime minister. They've been negotiating deals with Europe about how this is all going to work out. So referenda like this can have an unexpected consequence, right? Like he thought that he knew how it was going to go. Are they a good idea? Letting the people decide is attractive in a country like the United States that prides itself on a democracy. But how much responsibility do you want to take for the way that you're governed? Most of us are pretty comfortable with the idea that we should vote for who makes our own rules, but what if we had to vote on the rules themselves? California actually does this pretty often. They have a lot of referendum. Nationally, do we care enough or know enough to vote on laws for the country as a whole? Should we be governed more by public opinion than by the opinion of our elected leaders? Sometimes it's just kind of trendy to say we don't like in a public opinion polls. 65% of people think that polls are right only some of the time, and politicians are leery or even scornful of polls. But what's so bad about being ruled about polls in a democracy, which is supposed to be ruled by the people? If politics is about who gets what and how, shouldn't we care about what who thinks? Public opinion is, of course, the collective attitudes and beliefs of individuals on one or more issues, what the public thinks. Public opinion polls are scientific efforts to estimate what this entire group of people thinks about an issue by asking a smaller sample of the group for its opinion. This is nothing more than a scientific effort to measure the public's opinion. We want to believe that what we think matters, but we'd also like to think that our elected officials are guided by unwavering principles. Public opinion is important in a democracy for 2 reasons: normative and empirical. Normative being we believe public opinion should influence what the government does. And empirical. A lot of people behave as if public opinion does matter, so it does need to become a factor in American politics. Our founding is about rejecting the aristocracy and monarchy that had ruled us previously, and now the rise of popular sovereignty, the idea that people matter above all. The presence of the people in our Constitution is pervasive in all documents and narratives that create and support our government. The Declaration of Independence says the consent of the governed. The Constitution says we the people. The Gettysburg Address says the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Our very legitimacy of the United States government rests on the idea that government exists to serve the interests of citizens. But since our founding, there's been a shift in the greater role of citizenry in politics. The Seventh Amendment took the election of the Senate from the state legislatures to the citizens of the states. How do we determine? We have different views in our country. How do we determine whose views should be heard, right? We have different theories of democracy that prescribe different roles for the people, in part because those theories disagree about how competent the citizens of a country are to govern themselves. Do you trust your fellow citizens? I mean, think about when you're driving down the road and you're like, this is a stupid person driving this car in front of me. And you think about that sometimes, and maybe you wouldn't want your fellow citizens to be making all of our rules. I could be wrong. But elitists maybe say that citizens are too ignorant or ill-informed to be trusted with major political decisions. But there are proponents of participatory democracy that have faith that people are both smart enough and able to gather enough information to be effective decision makers. As Americans, we're confused about what the role of the democratic citizen should be. Should it be the virtuous citizen who is concerned for the common good, who recognizes that democracy carries obligations as well as rights? A citizen should be attentive to and informed about politics, exhibit political tolerance and a willingness to compromise, and practice high levels of participation in civic activities. Or are Americans apolitical, self-interested actors? As Americans, we're almost always the opposite of what I described as a virtuous citizen. We are inattentive, ill-informed, politically intolerant, and rigid, and unlikely to get involved in political life. It's weird for me to think about because I've always been involved in political life. The first thing we did when we moved to this area was figure out how to register as voters, register with the party that we identify with. But not everybody is like that. Maybe we're a little bit of both of these things. Maybe we are a virtuous citizen and apolitical and self-interested. We can have both of those things. Why does public opinion matter? Well, when members of Congress are voting on a major bill, they worry a lot about public opinion in their districts. There are a lot of really important things happening in Congress right now. They are voting on raising the debt ceiling. They are voting on a budget under which we're operating. They are voting on some major highway surface reauthorization bills. And they are very concerned about what people back home think about these things, what people in their districts think. The president usually has an in-house paid public opinion expert. The public may act as if they're not paying attention, but it can decisively if the provocation is sufficient. So like the 2006 midterm elections, the voters showed frustration with the war in Iraq by giving control of the House and Senate to the Democrats. Horse race polls, which you're saying who is ahead, like which horse is winning this race, ask about people's voting intentions and lead drama to media coverage of electoral races. But how do we measure up as citizens? We hold two different views on what citizenship is about. Usually we're somewhere in the middle. Some citizens tune out political news but are tolerant of others and vote regularly. Then there's a lot of activist citizens who are informed and opinionated and participatory but are really intolerant of others' views, which can make democratic politics difficult. So there's three elements of an ideal citizen. They have political knowledge, they have tolerance, and they participate. What of those is the most important? Political knowledge, tolerance, or participation? The ideal democratic citizen understands how the government works, who the main actors are, what the major principles that underlie the operation of the political system. But American actors are not very well informed about their political system. I mean, you guys taking this class are going to be more informed than a lot of other people. I could ask a lot of folks just walking down the street, what is the political party of our current president? And who is our current president? Joe Biden, and he's a Democrat. What about the Senate and the House of Representatives? Who is in control of both? Right now, the Democrats are in control of both. Virtually everybody can name the president, but a lot of people can't name other offices. Who is the Supreme Court Chief Justice? John Roberts. Is he conservative or liberal? Conservative. Who controls the House of Representatives? Like I just said, Democrats. Knowledge is key for knowing whom to thank or whom to blame for public policy. This is key information for holding our officials accountable. And a key demographic is tolerance. People jockey for position and competing visions of common good, for tolerance for ideas different than one's own, respect for the rights of others to provide oil to keep the democracy machine running smoothly. Tolerance is a prerequisite for compromise, which is an essential part of politics. Here in America, we have a history of denying even basic civil rights to some groups, but tolerance in general is on the rise since the civil rights movement of the 60s. There are small pockets of intolerance that still exist, of course, primarily among extremist groups. But one of the most consistent criticisms of Americans by those who are concerned with the democratic health of the nation is that we don't participate enough, which is usually correct. It makes me really upset, actually. Voter turnout in the United States ranks almost last among industrialized nations. You guys, we have got to vote. Voting is so important. If you learn one thing from me this semester, it's that I think voting is incredibly important. As soon as you're able to register to vote, please go register to vote. Please go vote. There are greater levels of participation seen among those with more education and higher income, which means not everybody is voting. But the elements of an ideal democratic citizen are not distributed equally across the population. Forces around us bring most of us to a consensus on the basics of a political culture, and more complex forces that guide us into adopting a more divisive ideology. Democracies depend on each new generation picking up the values and allegiances of previous generations. Beliefs in the legitimacy of political system and its leaders, and the willingness to obey the laws and commands of those leaders. The children in France or China support their leaders just as surely as the children of those in the United States. So political socialization is the process by which we learn our political orientations and political allegiances. This is transferred from generation to generation. We learn patriotism and good citizenship early on through agents like family and school and church, all of which have an interest in turning out well-behaved children with a loyalty to our country. Family is probably the biggest influence on our political development. Kids develop an emotional response to some fundamental objects. They learn that the police are good in most communities, that the president is important, that the flag deserves respect. I have a 3-year-old who knows the Pledge of Allegiance, and it happens early. Patriotism is a strong emotional attachment to one's political community. It develops in the preschool years. Watching the fireworks on the 4th of July, saying the pledge, makes children absorb that being from America is something special. But kids do tend to be in the same political party as their parents. It's funny, my parents are just not very political at all, and they never would really even tell me who they would vote for when I was growing up. And then here I am, spent my entire career working in politics, and it's been a vital part of my life. In fact, I met my husband because I worked in politics. So it didn't actually work that way for me, but kids do tend to be in the same political party as their parents. Schools, where you spend most of your day is you begin your day with the pledge. It's also an important agent of political learning, and it's important for the development of a citizen orientation. The groups we belong to also foster our basic values. Peer groups have influence on social and political attitudes, as do individuals who live in your neighborhood. It can be traced somewhat to the ways people select themselves into groups, but it's reinforced by social contracts and social media connections that allow us to expand the number of people we can talk to and build on and participate. And the process of talking, walking, working, worshiping together leads people to see the world similarly. The spiral of silence, though, is the process by which a majority opinion becomes exaggerated because minorities sometimes don't feel comfortable speaking out in opposition. The minority often silences themselves in the face of majority consensus, which tends to embolden the advocates of a majority opinion to speak even more confidently. What about differences in political opinion? Political socialization, produces a citizenry that largely agrees with the rules of the game and accepts the outcomes in the national political process as legitimate. But this doesn't mean that our nation is in agreement on most or even very many things. As we get older and exposed to more things, our opinions become much more complex. Divisive beliefs work against the positive feelings and we have towards government that we build in our early years. Occasionally, we solidify behind our government and leaders, but otherwise we trust. Our trust in the government reflects the divisions in our opinions and our loyalties to subgroups in the population. Some of the most significant effects of the Obama presidency were the opportunity for Black kids to realize the American dream of growing up to be president actually belongs to them too. Race has been more divisive than unifying in this country, and only recently have Blacks achieved the same political rights as the white majority, and the disparity of income really honestly continues. For many years, gender had almost no predictive policy in opinions and behaviors, except for that women were less active in politics and usually less warlike in their political attitudes. But of course, since the 60s, there's been a revolution here as well. Women gained more education, entered the workforce, and increased their levels in participation in politics. In the last century, women's attitudes on issues really diverged. The gender gap is the tendency of men and women to differ in their political views on the same issues, which usually means that women are a little more liberal than men. And the marriage gap is the tendency for married people to hold political opinions that differ from those people who have never married. Married people tend toward more traditional and conservative values. As people change their opinions as they age, experiences over time affects how we see the political world, but there's little evidence that people progress from this youthful idealism to mature conservatism. There's only small differences in policy preferences that are related to age, except in political engagement. Obviously, middle-aged and older citizens are usually more attentive to and active in politics. They vote more, they contribute more to campaigns. A lot of times this is related to settling down, marrying, having children, establishing career. But Obama, of course, brought a large number of young people to the polls. Political generations are groups of citizens whose political views have been shaped by the events of their youth. Growing up in the years after 9/11 gave a generation a set of values as surely as having grown up during the Civil Rights Movement, during World War II, during the Great Depression. And as older groups die, the overall opinion among the citizenry changes. This is a process of what's called generational replacement. Much of the division in contemporary public opinion can be described as ideological, liberal or conservative, or partisan, Democrat or Republican terms. Party identification refers to our relatively enduring allegiances. From our very early years, party labels provide mental cues that we use in interpreting and responding to personalities in news. Partisan sorting. This is the process through which citizens align themselves ideologically with one of the two parties, leaving fewer citizens remaining in the center and thus increasing party polarization. The average Republican and Democrat are much farther apart ideologically than ever before, which has had quite a profound impact on politics. Fewer people swing between candidates because fewer people come to elections with open minds. It makes it easier to demonize the opposition, which contributes to the nastiness and anger, which has contributed to disgust in politics in general, and the rising level of distrust in government. What if we separate citizen values into democratic enlightenment and democratic engagement? Democratic enlightenment refers to a citizen's ability to hold a democratic belief, including the idea that politics is about about compromise, and that sometimes the needs of the community will conflict with and override one's individual preferences. And then democratic engagement refers to a citizen's ability to better understand his or her own interests and how to pursue those interests in politics. They're both boosted by education. Better educated citizens are more likely to be more informed, more tolerant, more committed to democratic principles, and to vote and participate at all levels. What about economic self-interest? What's in it for me? Those in the lowest income brackets are the least likely to argue that too much money is being spent on welfare or they're paying too much taxes. Those with higher incomes are more likely to agree with those things. Religion. There are a lot of political issues that are tough on matters of deep moral convictions or values, which is the motivation for action in that group. Geographic distinction. Where we live matters. People in the Farm Belt are going to talk about things differently than the city dwellers in Manhattan. Politicians who come from these areas represent different things, and much of the politics in Congress is about being responsive to these differing opinions based in differing geographic areas. So given this central role that public opinion plays in democracy, finding out what the public thinks is important, and social scientists have gotten really good at this over the years. This is sometimes discounted by politicians who don't like their results, but they're pretty accurate nowadays. You know what your friends and family think about a lot of issues without actually conducting a poll. Simply just talking to people gives you a sense of ideas and preferences, and a lot of people are not shy about plastering their views on social media. We tend to hang around with people who share views that are similar to ours, which reinforces the idea that everyone in the world thinks the way we do. Politicians are good talkers and good listeners. They learn constituent opinions from a lot of different ways: letters, phone calls, emails, visits, and talks with leaders and representatives. Members of Congress use a lot of different sources to learn about public opinion: personal contacts, polling data, a lot of different things. A sample is the portion of the population that's selected to participate in a poll. There's also something called a sample bias that I'm sure you guys know about from other classes, is the effect of a sample that does not represent all segments of the population. Politicians need to allow for bias of their sampling, of course. And then the scientific poll that we know today was developed in the 1930s. Newspapers and politicians have been trying to read public opinion as long as we've had democracies. There was a straw poll, polls that attempt to determine who's ahead in the political race. The name comes from the fact that literally a straw thrown up into the air will indicate which way the wind is blowing, which way the political wind is blowing. These polls help politicians predict which way the political wind is blowing, who's going to win an upcoming election. Today, polling is a big business and relatively precise. All polls face the same two challenges: getting a good sample and asking questions that yield good results. How big does a sample need to be? No sample is perfect in matching the population from which it's drawn, but it should be close. Gallup said, okay, if you don't like the idea of a sample, the next time you go for a blood test, tell them to take it all. A poll's reliability is indicated by its sampling error, which is a number that indicates within what range the results of the poll are accurate. Typically, we'll say it's within the margin of error, plus or minus 3%. So there's a 95% chance that the real figure for the whole population is within that 3% reported. The larger the sample, the smaller the sampling error to a certain point. Modern polls now employ systematic random samples of population whose opinions they want to describe. So a random sample could be a sample chosen in such a way that a member of the population being polled has any equal chance of being selective. And the chief form of sample bias in current surveys, honestly, now is the non-response bias, the skewing of data that occurs when there is a difference in opinion between those who choose to participate and those who do not. Pollsters deal with the problem of differential response rates also. This yields a sample that maybe it doesn't look geographically like the population that's being sampled, and so they have to weight the sample to match what the census says the population should look like. Weighting is an adjustment to the survey, making it look like it's measured the way it's measured by a census. Technology has become a pollster's friend, but can also create unexpected challenges. Computers can now do the telephone interviewing. This is called robocalling. It's a lot cheaper than using human interviewers, but it's also controversial and easily abused. Computers provide another challenge in the form of online surveys. Pollsters can create panels of internet users who regularly log in to deliver their opinions on matters the pollsters select. They are relying on strict probability samples, but they match fairly well with traditional telephone interviewing. The three main points with respect to constructing a survey question is that first, the respondents should be asked about things that they know about, they have thought about. You do not need to include if you do need to include an I don't know category, because this will lessen the chance that the survey participant will try to bluff their way through the question they know nothing about. The second is that the question shouldn't be ambiguous. You should have straightforward questions. The third is that similar questions can yield surprisingly different results, depending on the wording. The order of which questions are asked can also change the results, as can such a simple factor as the number of choices offered for responses. Many people and organizations report the results of what they claim are measures of public opinion. So to make sense of this, it's useful to know some basic polling terminology and the characteristics of different types of polls. So some efforts to measure public opinions within a limited period of time using a national representative as a sample. The time period here could be as short as a few hours, with the results reported the next day, or even extended over a period of weeks, like an academic poll. But the goal is the same: to achieve scientifically valid measures of the knowledge, belief, or attitude of the adult population. Many national polls are now conducted by the media with conjunction of a professional polling organization. For instance, how does the public feel about the job the president is doing? Other polling organizations provide more in-depth surveys. Some are designed to see how people feel about a particular topic or find out how people develop attitudes and evaluate politics more generally, provides a lot of data for the academic research on public opinion in America. So in campaigns, so we got campaign polls here. A lot of well-funded campaigns start with what's called a benchmark poll. This is an initial poll on a candidate and issues on which campaign strategy is based and against which later polls are compared. This is kind of a baseline when you start to run for office. Presidential campaigns also, and a lot of better funded statewide races, conduct what's called a tracking poll, which is an ongoing series of surveys that follows changes in public opinion over time. Daily samples are maybe too small for a reliable generalization, but they average them over time, and that can be extremely helpful. If there's a sudden change in a tracking poll, this might signal that like an opponent's new ad is doing damage or an interest group's endorsement is having an effect. On election night, media commentators often call a race, saying that one candidate is a winner, sometimes as soon as the voting booth has closed. These predictions are usually made because of what's called an exit poll, which is an election-related question asked of a voter right after they vote. Pseudo polls. These are some public opinion studies that are maybe wrongly presented as a poll. A push poll is a poll that asks for a reaction to a hypothetical, often false information in order to manipulate public opinion. This is often used by a pollster and a campaign strategist to find out how a voter might respond to negative information about the candidate. It is not good, and a candidate might never know if they're being targeted, but suddenly don't have the time to rebut these lies that were told in these. Legislation on push polling has been introduced in a lot of legislatures, but we're unsure if they can survive a First Amendment challenge before the Supreme Court. Polls conducted by social scientists are not so much to gauge and measure public opinions about elections, but especially on controversial issues where respondents know the socially acceptable answer. So people are less likely to disclose their true opinions. So how accurate are polls? For a lot of issues, like your attitude toward the environment, the presidential approval, we have no objective measure against which to judge the accuracy of a public opinion poll. But election predictions, we can tell by the vote count whether the polls are correct. Almost all major polls have predicted the winner of presidential elections correctly since 1980, except of course the 2000 election that was so incredibly close. Nothing has ever been correct to the percentage point. Polls taken closer to election day typically become more accurate as they catch more of the late deciders. Politicians act as though citizens are informed and attentive, but only some Americans really live up to our model of good citizenship. And those who do often belong disproportionately to the ranks of the well-educated, well-off, and older portions of the population. That's why we've got to vote, guys. Were the founders right to limit the influence of masses on government? Do we want less informed and less coherent opinions to be represented in politics? Can democracy survive if it's only run by an older, educated elite? It may not be rational for all people to be deeply immersed in the minutiae of day-to-day politics like I am. People have families, jobs, hobbies, which leave little time for in-depth study of political issues. My other job is in-depth study of political issues, so I spend a lot of time doing this. But it might be rational for us to leave most people who are not in positions of me to leave the political information gathering to others. Rational ignorance is the state of being uninformed about politics because of the cost in time and energy. It doesn't mean we're ignorant. Citizens are generally pretty smart, and voters usually behave much more intelligently than we could ever guess from their answers to surveys about politics. We use a lot of mental shortcuts, online processing, and the two-step flow of information. Online processing, not like signing in online, but it's the ability to receive and evaluate information as events happen, kind of in line, allowing us to remember an evaluation even if we've forgotten the specific events that cause it. A lot of evaluations we make are on the fly, and we assemble impressions and reactions while we're just leading our lives. And suddenly we have an opinion about something and we're not sure why, because it just happens on the fly sometimes. And then the two-step flow of information, the process by which citizens take their political cues from more well-informed opinion leaders. We can only absorb a fraction of the mass amount of information sent out by politicians and the media. And even then, sometimes it's hard to interpret it. So we rely on opinion leaders. people who know more about certain topics than we do, whose advice we trust and seek out and follow. Think about it. If you're buying a car, you ask someone you know who drives it what they think. Sometimes we get an opinion online, from social media, from blogs, from comments and reviews made by others. Technology allows us to ask a lot of experts. And the same thing happens politically. We can behave as though we are well informed without it requiring us to expend all the resources that being informed entails. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me. Quiz 3 will be posted, and we have our second exam next week. See you then.